Welcome to an event today for defense priorities on defense burden sharing in Europe. I'm Ben Friedman. I'm the policy director at Defense Priorities. I think we have an exciting event. We're going to talk about different approaches to sharing the load of defending, primarily against Russia. We have three speakers today who are going to talk on this topic. The first is Justin Logan, who's the director of foreign policy at the Cato Institute. He is the author of a new study called Uncle Sucker: Why U.S. Efforts at Defense Burden Sharing Fail. The second speaker is Rajan Menon, who is our director of grant strategy at Defense Priorities. He's also an emeritus professor at CUNY, New York, and he's the author of a recent paper also on the same topic, elaborating how the United States could have a better deal in terms of its defense posture in Europe. And finally, from the Atlantic Council, we have Rizzo, who will be speaking to some of her recent writing on the same topic, and particularly the role of Germany as central to European defense efforts. So with that, Justin, why don't you take it away?
Great. Well, thanks to you, Ben. Thanks to my fellow panelists and to Defense Priorities for pulling this together. As ever in this business, we always have to say it's unfortunate that this is the timely subject. It's unfortunate that this is a timely subject. But it's going to be weird today because it's sort of the panelist will go first. I think we're engaged in a silly charade about burden shifting in Europe. It's more or less the same silly charade that we've been engaged in for about the last 60 years. And there's very little prospect that the militarily important parts of Europe are going to step up in a meaningful way. I think, the Zeitenwende, which I think is going to be if not the centerpiece of the discussion this morning, has amounted mostly to a make-work project for think tanks. I think there was a glimmer of hope last spring that it could have been something substantive. In the intervening months, of course, the Biden administration sent 20,000 more U.S. troops to Europe and rushed into the breach to assure the Europeans that every square inch of NATO territory was covered and covered adequately by NATO, and with NATO, the United States. So I think we're likely to see a fusillade of reports, and we really already have, about whether the Zeitenwende at 5, the Zeitenwende at 10. It's going to be something we continue to hear about. I just think it's not something that's going to be materially terribly important. In an April 1st Reuters report that was unfortunately not a prank, the German defense minister announced that, quote, the existing gaps in German defense cannot be completely closed by 2030. Meanwhile, the Germans and the French and others are planning naval exercises in the Indo-Pacific. And if you talk to the Europeans, they really get the vapors when they are viewed as a theater rather than a global partner of the United States, to include in Asia. If you talk to the French about this, you'll hear great soliloquies about the importance of French Polynesia to the French people, et cetera, et cetera. But the basic proposition is the same one that has endured for the last 60 years. If the United States is willing to pay to subsidize European security, the Europeans are likely to let it, continuing to do so. And I think the Biden administration took what really was a shock to the system in Europe and sort of assuaged any paranoia about what this meant for European defense. as we talked to Biden administration officials over the course of the last year, they repeatedly grudgingly shrugged that, yes, of course, we would like for the Europeans to do more. But in a formulation that one of those officials gave, we just aren't willing to put an or else at the end of that sentence. And I think you have three generations of policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic that have been socialized into an environment in which the basic proposition that the U.S. will subsidize European security forever has endured. And I think that there's very little sign that the Biden administration, or really any administration on the horizon — we might want to talk about the notional Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis administration — is going to force this issue on the Europeans. And my bottom line is that if the Americans don't force the issue on the Europeans, very little is likely to change. So I think, as an opening comment, I'd do best to leave it there. And thank you.
Okay, Raj, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. My comments will overlap not in words, but in substance with Justin's. Let me begin by saying that the proposition that the Europeans could not defend themselves absent a open-ended, substantial, permanent American presence in Europe at one point made sense, because after the end of World War II, most of Europe lay in ruins. The Red Army, even though it had taken great casualties, was in the middle of Europe. There was the Warsaw Pact facing NATO. By now, however, I think that truism has long since ceased to be true, even though it is an article of faith, not only on that side of the Atlantic, but oddly enough, also on this side of the Atlantic. Now, why is it no longer appropriate to hold on to this shibboleth? Just in terms of raw capacity, the EU has 75% of the GDP of the United States. It has a population that's 100 million or so larger. The putative adversary is Russia, and the EU has a GDP that's about 9.5 times that of Russia, and a population that's at 3 times as much. So it's impossible to make the argument that there is an incapacity on the part of Europe to do more. I should also add that in other important measures, such as the quality of human capital, the level of technology, the number of patents that are produced each year, whatever index you use, it is impossible, I think, to reach the conclusion that Europe cannot do so. Yet on certain metrics, they still continue to fall short. So let's look at the 2014 Wales Summit guideline of all NATO members spending 2%. I think now about 8 or 9 of the 29 non-US countries do that. They do better on another metric, 20% of military expenditure on equipment. But even the GDP thing. Now, people say, well, why do you attach so much significance to that? I think GDP per this expenditure of on the military as a percentage of GDP is at the very least an indication of how much importance the country attaches to national defense. But the other problem is that the lesson that has been taken from the appalling Russian performance in Ukraine is that actually it is even more important now for the United States to maintain an overriding presence in Europe, because Europe cannot defend itself, as witness what the Russian army has done in it to Ukraine, i.e. invaded it, destroyed large parts of it, and annexed significant parts of it. To me, the lesson is quite the opposite, that the Russian army, which at the end of the Putin modernization program that began in 2008 was hailed as a spanking new, highly capable force, has shown itself to be a force that cannot defeat even a manifestly weak adversary, and is stuck in the Donbass and has been trying to take a town, Bakhmut, which now has a population of about 7,000, did have 70,000 before the war, for something like 7 months. Now, the problem is that this change cannot happen quickly. That is to say, Europe cannot share the burden more effectively, nor can the burden be shifted where Europe takes a greater role in its defense all of a sudden because there's a backlog. My worry is that there is no plan to do so. And as Justin mentioned, as long as the United States provides, in effect, an open-ended commitment to defend Europe, there is no incentive to do so. There's one other change that's happened. The center of gravity in NATO now has shifted to the eastern flank, the Baltic countries, Poland, and I think with the advent of the Finns and the Swedes, probably them as well. And certainly the Balts and the Poles are of the opinion that it is actually very important for the United States to maintain a permanent commitment and to beef up its commitment to the eastern flank and to remain permanently on the eastern flank. So I'm not hopeful that the changes that I favor, and I think Justin favors, will happen. But I think one of the reasons it will not happen is that the United States, in a sense, enables it. And this is my last point. Why do we enable it? I think partly it is because the United States remains a European power, and the defense of Europe, the most basic thing one can do for a country, is part of what makes for American primacy in the world. Ben, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Raj. And by the way, Raj's paper is called "Reconfiguring NATO: The Case for Burden Shifting." I meant to say that before. That came out a few months back. It's on the Defense Priorities website. With that, Rachel, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. First of all, Justin, I really thought the paper was interesting, and it provided a really good historical look, especially at burden sharing, that I think often gets lost in the day-to-day discussions about not just burden sharing in general, but for me specifically, why we find ourselves in the position we find ourselves today in relation to Europe. I've spent a lot of time over the last few years thinking about this idea of European strategic autonomy. And I remember a few months ago preparing for a discussion much like the one we're having today, and reading a piece on this very topic that was completely topical to the debate that we're having today. And then I looked at the date it was written, and it was in like July or August of 2000 or something like that, meaning that we've been having the exact same debate for at least the last 23 years, if not much longer than that. I think what we really lose sight of is the fact that the United States has played a major role in the place that we find ourselves today with Europe, which means they're still not a credible actor in terms of security and defense, and they are still woefully dependent on U.S. security guarantees. What I found really interesting about Justin's paper was that historically it seemed as though the U.S. really liked to complain a lot and threatened to decrease its security commitments to Europe, but never actually followed through with any of it. And now what's happened is that, at least in my mind, the issue of U.S. commitment to Europe has become more politically polarized today than it has been in previous decades. But what has stayed consistent is the desire for the U.S. To have at least some control over European policy. So, like, look at the Trump administration, for example. On one hand of this equation, you have Trump frustrated with European free riding, talking about how the U.S. gets the least out of its NATO membership of all the allies. Trump talking about decreasing or threatening to decrease U.S. troop presence in Germany, and even talking about the European Union as an institution that was created to economically undermine the United States. So for people who want the U.S. to shift some of its security burdens to European partners, you would hear these things and think, hey, maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe we're going somewhere with this. But no, that's wrong, because then in 2017, you had EU member states finally sign on to PESCO, this permanent structured cooperation, which basically allows willing EU member states to cooperate on specific defense capability projects. And the Trump administration had a fit. You had high-level Defense Department political appointees saying, well, we're supportive of it as long as it's complementary to and not distracting from NATO's activities and requirements, which sounds very similar to the things that Madeleine Albright said in the late 90s. The U.S. permanent The U.S. ambassador to NATO, Kay Bailey Hutchison at the time, also said they didn't want PESCO to turn into a protectionist vehicle for EU defense, meaning that the U.S. always wants to make sure that they can sell defense equipment to Europe. So we've played a major role in where we are today. And I think what's really interesting is that Germany, as Justin mentioned, and the Zeitenwende is going to play a major role in where we go forward from here. It needs to be a real thing. Europe can't be a bigger player without Germany sticking to its defense commitments. Justin mentioned that the German defense minister recently said that the current capability gaps can't be fully filled by 2030, and that's true. But we have some good news in that Germany is, making new orders of F-35 fighter jets and heavy transport helicopters from the U.S. We can talk later about why those orders are coming from the U.S. rather than from Europe. That's a different topic. But you're right, Justin. If the Zeitenwende turns out to be a passing fad without any substance behind it, we're in really big trouble. And as we're heading into the 2024 election season, Germany is going to end up being a proxy for a whole set of ills affecting the U.S.-European relationship. And the rhetoric, I think, is going to end up being focused on Germany, not Brussels' inability to meet its commitments. So I think I'll stop there and we can sort of take the conversation wherever we like. But in short, I thought the paper was really interesting, and I think it adds a lot to the debate.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I have a lot of questions, but what I want to start with is something you touched on at the end or in the middle there, Rachel, which is the history of the U.S. approach to this topic. And I should say the topic is not just how much Europeans spend, but how they cooperate, which is where the strategic autonomy comes up, which is just the idea that in some form or another, Europeans are organizing their defense without the United States being central, at least. Yeah, let me start with Justin. Since your paper gets into this substantially, what's the sort of history of the U.S. attitude about this? Have we always wanted the Europeans to pick up the burden, or what?
Well, there's been a disconnect between what we've said and what we've done, and I thought Rachel illuminated that quite well. We've always pounded the table and acted furious that the Europeans weren't doing more. And so the title of my paper comes from Dwight Eisenhower in 1959, lamenting to his stackyard that the Europeans are in jeopardy of turning the United States into a sucker by not carrying their share of the load. And that's basically a through line through almost all U.S. presidents during the Cold War. The Clinton administration, as Rachel pointed out, sent Madeleine Albright to Saint-Malo to basically try to strangle the baby in the cradle. It might not have needed strangling. I think it was probably terminally ill on its own, but of European security cooperation apart from the United States. And so we've had this ambivalence where we're always constantly complaining. Robert Gates saying the American taxpayer is not going to put up with this forever. The American taxpayer had been putting up with it for 50 plus years by that point. So it was pretty likely that they were going to continue putting up with it. And we're just now, 10 or 11 years later after Gates's speech, getting around to that. So there's been this dualism where there's been tons and tons of complaining, but substantively there's either been ambivalence or, as Rachel pointed out, an effort to scuttle efforts on Europe's part to do more among themselves ex-US. So I think that there's a weird duality here.
Yeah, and just quickly, why scuttle? Why is that?
Well, how cynical do you want to be? I mean, it's obviously the case that the Americans love having outsized influence in Europe. And that's a big part of it. And I think, in the early years of the Cold War, having outsized impact on European security was a better case to make than today. I mean, the weird thing to me is you get, card-carrying Brookings Institution liberal internationalists who you say, well, look, if the United States were to pull out of NATO, start sounding like John Mearsheimer from the 1990s, right? That there's going to be this avalanche of terrible outcomes up to maybe kind of sort of European security cooperation. And I just think that's fanciful, right? I think that the main militarily important parts of Europe from the US point of view are quite safe. the kind of indefensible member states of NATO are still kind of indefensible. And these underlying realities sort of go beyond the alliance commitments. You know, Glenn Snyder wrote decades ago that alliance commitments create interests. And I think, you know, there's a danger that they've done that in places like the Balts, where we admitted them in 2004 and didn't even have a plan for their defense until 2010. And even then, the plan for their defense was stick some tripwire forces and pray. And I think that's not the height of defense policy making.
Yeah, they might also create some domestic interests. Raj or Rachel, Raj first, maybe did you want to speak to this history?
Yes, very briefly. I want to emphasize a point that Rachel made because it cannot be emphasized enough. I think the narrative where fingers are pointed at Europe and Europe is called names and we threaten to pull out of Europe, that's just wrong because we are, as she pointed out, and I think Justin mentioned the same thing, substantially part of the problem. This wouldn't exist if we didn't enable it. We have a vested interest in having a strong position in Europe. We think that playing the guarantor's role in Europe's defense allows us to have that position. How else would you explain a very curious phenomenon? That is, Europe's richest country, Germany, has an army that is so deficient that two successive parliamentary commissioners for the Bundeswehr, Eva Holnau and Hans-Peter Bartels before her, wrote scathing reports pointing out not just that there weren't enough tanks and aircraft, but night vision goggles, flak jackets, elementary things. The Germans spend, as a proportion of GDP, somewhat less than half of what we do. That kind of thing is inexcusable. One final thing, Ben, you know, we talk about burden sharing and burden shifting much more now in the post-World War period, but the kinds of quotes that both Rachel and Justin have reminded us of, I've traced it back, and it may go back further, at least to the Kennedy administration. There's always been this, oh, the Europeans aren't doing enough, they're fleecing the American taxpayer. But the bottom line is we want them to do more kind of at the margins, but not anything even close to autonomy. Let's leave aside defense autonomy. Even within NATO, there's enormous leeway, I think, given the revival of Europe and the weakness of Russia now, for the Europeans to do much more. And I'm with Justin. I don't, I can't for the life of me understand why there is this, on the one hand, this belief that Europe is extremely vulnerable without the US, and then this piddling around in East Asia. If you're so vulnerable in Europe, then you should focus your resources on the area that you feel most needs defending, which is the continental Europe.
Rachel, do you have an addition?
Yeah. I mean, I think Raj and Justin have highlighted this pretty well, but you know, the US is completely torn between these contradictory goals of preserving its indispensability in Europe and also wanting Europe to do more. And because of this confusion, we really get trapped in this cycle where we demand that European countries spend more on defense, but they have to buy American and they shouldn't buy European. And look at some of the responses that we've had to EU, specifically EU defense efforts. This US-EU security dialogue has been totally focused on creating an administrative arrangement with the EU and the United States. And when you look at permanent structured cooperation, PESCO, the US lobbied for years to make sure that they could have third-party participation in EU defense projects. So I think one way to get out of this rut would be for the US to reverse its opposition to EU defense integration initiatives and outwardly encourage more EU funding for these efforts, which means that the US should stop lobbying for access to EU defense funds and instead use the influence that it has with European member states to really push these countries to support more funding for EU procurement programs. I think Max Bergman and Sophia Besch wrote about this in Foreign Affairs recently. You know, the United States is completely addicted to selling arms to Europe. And I really would highlight this piece for people to go back and read. They talk about every weapon sale to Europe weakens the European defense industrial base by depriving a European company of its core market. It's what happens whenever a European country buys a Patriot air defense system from U.S. company Raytheon instead of a SAMP-T system from MBDA. It's what happens when Europeans buy F-16s instead of the Saab Gripen, or an Abrams tank instead of a Challenger or a Leclerc or a Leopard. So we really need to think about the effect that the impact of American arms sales has had on Europe's defense industrial base, and really try to figure out how we can play a role in reversing what we have what we've done over the last 3-4 decades.
Did you want to add something, Justin?
Yeah, if I could just leave it to the Cato guy to make the crude Marxist point here. I think it's really important for people, and the article that Rachel mentions and Rachel's explanation of it is terrific. We complain in the United States, or some of us complain about the military-industrial congressional complex, right? There are these gremlins running around here within a 10-mile radius from where I'm sitting right now, propping up the U.S. defense budget. We try to cut the darn thing, but we just can't, because these moneyed interests are just propping up the U.S. defense budget. That's the crude Marxist version, but it's not totally wrong. What we should want is for European politics to look more like U.S. politics in this sense, for there to be upward pressure from jobs, from regional economic development that is provided by European production of defense equipment. And so that, and needless to say, those gremlins that I just mentioned don't like this idea for very good reasons, because it's bad for their bottom line. But if we actually wanted to hand off some of the again, U.S. subsidy for European defense that we've been providing, we need that as a sort of political ballast to that project to create interests in Europe for more European defense spending.
Thanks. Yeah. What are some ways, aside from jacking up the percentage of GDP that goes to defense? I mean, Rachel, you talked about PESCO. Permanent structured cooperation, but for instance, there was a recent announcement that the Scandinavians are going to be cooperating on integrating air operations. I mean, what are some ways that Europeans can act to improve their collective defense capability, short of just spending more money? Go ahead, go first if you want.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think the Europeans have actually done a good job since 2014 of increasing their defense budgets. So I don't necessarily think that's the main problem we're looking at. I think what we're looking at is a problem of collective action in the European Union. And it's really good to remember that spending more on defense doesn't translate into spending better. When you look at defense fragmentation in Europe, 90% of investments spent in different European countries are on their own national defense industries. And that's a massive issue. You've had the EU step in specific ways. They've taken the lead on things like the European Defense Fund, the European Peace Facility. There's been a joint procurement task force and a new $500 million fund available for the next couple of years to coordinate and incentivize joint acquisitions. But we need to remember, I think, that this can't substitute member states taking responsibility and making key decisions to invest jointly in defense. It's up to European countries to make changes to their own industries. And there's only so much nudging that Brussels can do. What's interesting is in Europe, they use 29 different destroyers, 17 tanks, 20 fighter planes. So where we would have to go in order to assuage some of these problems with defense fragmentation, we're looking years down the line.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like PESCO is an example of trying to get around this, but I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but that in some ways NATO could be an obstacle in that, there's, what do we have now, 30 members? We're about to have 30 members with Finland, is that right?
Yeah, we're about to have 31.
31. So, okay, so even if you're not worried about the United States, you're talking about consensus among a high 20s number of countries to do something, and that, is a lot harder to get than getting getting a few countries to cooperate. Did Raj, did you have anything on this?
I just want to say a couple of things. I think what is needed, first of all, is for European leaders to stop mantra-like repeating over and over again to their publics that without the United States, Europe is capable of defending itself. And you hear that every day. That narrative has consequences for the way European people at large and European elites think about defense. The second is that there has to be a strategic concept of if the Europeans were to reduce their reliance on the United States, that is not just spend more. Rachel's correct. You can spend more and spend lousy. If you want to take on more of the burden, what does greater European, I won't use autonomy, greater European self-sufficiency look like? So Rachel pointed out the importance of ending duplication in defense production. That's one step. But you need some plan of how you're going to get there. As it stands, I hate to come back and make Germany the whipping boy, but as for the Zeitenwende, so last year, Schultz said, I'm going to set aside, 130 billion euros for this. It turns out that about 9-10% of it has been spent so far. And we have Pistorius, the defense minister, saying that his major priority is to bring spending up to 2%. Well, they've had a decade to do that since Wales. And why is it that Germany hasn't done that? So I think it's not just a question of individual countries' will. I think Europe has to sort of de-infantilize itself and think about it as a place that should take more of a role and can and work out a plan. And if I were a European, I'd want to do that because I think the logic of events suggests that the United States is going to be much more ensconced, whether one likes it or not, in East Asia. So if you're a European and you're really concerned about your security, this is the time to come up with a plan of action. And I don't think it helps to say they should do it outside of NATO, inside of NATO. I think that's not going to sell. I think the first step would be within NATO, what are you going to do so that more of the burden for the defense of Europe, including on the eastern flank, is carried by Europeans? It seems to me there's no reason that that can't happen except for the things that we've talked about.
There's an excessive amount of consensus here, so I want to try to be the voice of dispute.
Can I say one thing, Ben?
Is it contrary? Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we should give Germany a little bit of lenience here. And I know that that's not a popular opinion in this group, and I understand why. And of course, Germany has a long way to go in investing in the Bundeswehr and getting up to its defense commitments. Like, all of those things are right. But I think we also need to understand, as I'm sure Raj and Justin both do, that like this shift in Germany is not just about getting them to spend more on defense. This is about completely shifting Germany's mindset in terms of the role that it plays as a European actor, but as a global actor as well. This is so embedded in the German psyche, and it goes back so long, that the changes we're asking Germany to make, that they should have made over the last 10 or 15 years, I completely agree, they are not gonna happen this year or next year or probably 5 years from now. We're looking at years down the line. And so really the question for me is like, how does the US push Germany in this direction and both give it some leniency and patience for these shifts, but also like encourage it to make the changes that it needs to make? I just think Germany's a really easy case to harp on. And I think that sometimes we might harp on them a little too much.
Well,
so
let me
contradictory enough.
I would be even more contradictory. So no one's a bigger defender these days of Germany than me, in a sort of different way, which is, why on earth should they spend more in defense? We rushed all these troops into Europe, 20,000 more since the war in Ukraine started. Subsequent to that, we have Russia, as Raj talked about, sort of running aground and demonstrating for the world it's the difficulties of conquering other countries, but it's particular and peculiar incompetence in a lot of ways. So anyone, we assess threats as intent and capability. We can, intent might be bad, but the capability is not what the sort of conventional wisdom was. So if I'm Germany, I'm saying I might be spending too much on defense. We got Uncle Sucker, as Justin puts it, rushing in to help us. And in the meantime, Russia doesn't look so fearsome. So, maybe we should go in the opposite direction. And, maybe them backing away from their promises of a year ago is just very rational behavior, as is, they're, wanting to spend their money on, pensions and other welfare creating endeavors rather than on tanks and aircraft. Justin.
Yeah, I mean, I will associate myself, maybe unsurprisingly, with what you just said. No, I think it's, as an American, the German policy frustrates me. As a kind of sort of IR scholar, it makes perfect sense, and they're behaving perfectly rationally and jealous of their own taxpayer dollars. So this is the sort of conceit, is that, I'll be the bad guy that says, the transatlantic community contains states which have overlapping but not identical interests. And so the US interest here might be for Germany to get shaken by the lapels a little bit, as it was when Russia invaded Ukraine, to say, hey, things look kind of scary. It's not this postmodern world that we all may have hoped it was. And if you look at the polling in Germany last spring around the launch of the Zeitenwende, the public opinion was like high 60s, low 70s in favor of €100 billion defense fund, hitting 2% of GDP in terms of defense. So there was this sort of shock. So somebody was talking about this paper of mine on a podcast and said, oh, well, this is a tough time for Logan to be making these arguments about, getting the Europeans to do more. I said, no, it's exactly the right time, because we have this exogenous shock that happened. If it was just the dreary days of, 2013, we wouldn't even be having this event.
Raj, did you want to add? There's another thing, I think, two other things that I can see complicating the shift that we want here that we've been talking about. One is, what happens to the reconstruction costs of post-war Ukraine? I think the Europeans are of a mind, and I think they're right, that we will say that we carried the bulk of the burden on defense by far. And when it comes to your economic reconstruction, we'll certainly be part of it, but you should play the major role. Now, that creates all kinds of budgetary consequences for distribution of resources within Europe, but it also means there's a finite amount of money to go around. So I think the commitments to Ukraine, whatever they may be, will be another reason why the Europeans argue, well, we can't do both things, Washington. We can't pick up the slack on reconstructing Ukraine that you want us to do and spend more on defense. But this question of why things remain the way they are, it comes back to a point that both Justin and Rachel have made already. But it's, we like the status quo, and they like the status quo. It's in nobody's interest to change it, except for those of us who call for burden shifting. But I think the conversation that we're having here is not representative of majority thinking in Washington. Quite the contrary. I mean, I've been told that talk like this is dangerous because it could unravel the whole transatlantic relationship, as if the relationship between the United States and Europe, which is multifaceted, cultural, economic, diplomatic, would completely come unstuck if there was more European effort at defense. If that's the case, we're in really big trouble. If the only thing that holds us and Europe together is the American security guarantee and nothing else, which I think is absurd, then we're really in great difficulty. But I've been told this by a person who shall remain nameless, who's now a fairly senior official in the administration. He said, this is just completely reckless because you will undermine the entire transatlantic relationship. I said, no, I'm just asking to change the nature of that relationship.
Rachel, you have your hand on the beating pulse of the establishment there at the Atlantic Council. I mean, do you want to just speak to the sort of the politics of this? I mean, we have Ukraine, so those on the panel, I think, have a particular view of the military lessons, which are, go to the point that Justin in particular is making, Raj, that, we don't need to do so much, but the politics, it seems to me, are maybe pointed the other way. Anyway, do you want to, respond to Raj and talk about how this is all perceived and how much room there is in U.S. political discourse for changes on this front?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, it comes back down to the difference between what we say and what we do. I think what the war in Ukraine has done is sort of exacerbated this divide between those who say the war has just brought to bear the fact that the United States needs to recommit to Europe, and we told you so, and we should increase our troop presence on the European continent, and recommit to our role as the ultimate backer of European security. And there's also a group of people who say that we can't get distracted by Ukraine, that the Indo-Pacific region and China as the pacing threat should be where the United States focuses our strategic attention. But, the problem is, like, look at what the national security strategy says, for example. Europe clearly comes after the Indo-Pacific in terms of regional priorities. And you talk to people both in the government, in think tanks, in Europe, and they notice this, they point it out. Then on the other side of that, you have the reaction of the United States to the war in Ukraine, which was immediately to commit permanent troop presence to Poland, which would have been a really good opportunity to say, Europe, here's how you should step up to the plate and support them in doing so. The problem is, I think Raj is right. Like, there's really no real room in Washington's political circles to make the argument at this point that the US should shift its burdens, because it is being seen as completely reckless, which I think is a huge problem in today's rhetoric. Like, you can't really say anything on this subject without being called like Putin's stooge, like being called someone who's parroting pro-Russia talking points. And I think that's indicative of where we are and where we probably are continuing to go.
Ben, can I pick up on Rachel's point very quickly? Because I think it's an important one. We can talk a little bit more about it. In addition to the issues we've been discussing, why do we want the status quo? Why do the Europeans like the status quo? Both, I think, have been explained quite well. There needs to be a discussion about what are the lessons of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Did we get the nature of the Russian military threat completely wrong? Because if you look at the analyses that preceded the war, most people expected a very quick victory, including Mr. Putin, I suspect. I mentioned the post-2008 military modernization reform. There was an article in The Economist in 2021 that said NATO had better watch out because the Soviet military machine is now a gleaming juggernaut. I'm using poetic license here. So there needs to be this lesson. Why? Because you hear now over and over again, why is it that the Ukraine war is so important? It's because Ukraine is defending all of Europe. The implication being that this is not just a war that threatens Ukraine's territorial integrity, which it does, but absent Ukraine as a bulwark, Putin would be in Central Europe. I think we need to have a real discussion about whether the performance of the Russian military shows any such capacity on the part of Europe. So the case for burden sharing, burden shifting is even greater because the Russian military threat is in fact lower.
Justin, go ahead, Rachel. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Raj, I would take it a step further and say that what the war in Ukraine has done is not just ask the question about like NATO deterrence and the threat to Europe's own continental security. We have attributed to the Ukraine war the entire protection and defense of the liberal international order. Like, we have assigned this war so much global importance that I think it becomes hard to have real debates about, at least right now, where we are and where we're going. I don't know if you.
I agree completely.
Like,
Justin, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just again walk into reactionary caricature here and admit that I
The
think
shoe
that
fits.
U.S. policy in Europe should be counter-hegemonic. It should be aimed at preventing the emergence of a Eurasian hegemon, which we all remember from our graduate seminars. And we should ask ourselves, if Russia were to conquer all of Ukraine without a shot having been fired, would it make Russia or bring Russia close to being a European hegemon? Now, old-fashioned guys like me remember that, well, Ukraine was part of the USSR when we used to worry about the emergence of a Eurasian hegemon. So it seems to me, and oddly enough, it seemed to Robert Kagan, who made these remarks at the Brookings Institution about his book, that the idea that this war impinges on U.S. national security is kind of fanciful. Now, for Kagan, it's about the liberal world order, the democratic world order, this abstraction that we always hear about. That's this sort of rhetorical backstop for expansive policies. But if our policy in Europe is actually counter-hegemonic, we're there, right? Germany is not, again, the 1990s nightmare offensive realist scenario seems totally, unthinkable. And now we have the Russian military at a horrendous cost to Ukraine and a bunch of Russian people and all the rest of it, having revealed its military has zero prospect in the policy relevant future of being a threat at hegemony in Eurasia. So to me, it's a question of taking the win, right? It's horrible. I see all the same videos and images that everyone sees, and it turns my stomach just the same way it turns anyone's stomach. But we have to think at the strategic level, what does this mean for Europe if our policy is in fact counter-hegemonic? And I think the fact that we are interpreting the war as the sort of establishment is interpreting the war suggests to us in a very important way that U.S. policy in Europe, in fact, is not counter-hegemonic. That it has much broader ambitions than that. And so, again, my preference would be to just take the win, say there's no prospective hegemon in Europe, and that's the U.S. interest. But we don't seem to be there. And I don't think it's because of differing empirical judgments about the Russian military's performance in Ukraine.
Ben, can I just build on this?
Yes.
This brings to mind a saying that's well known in Washington of Madden and Albright, that the United States is the indispensable nation. It stands taller and sees higher, sees further than anyone else. So I think that is the vision that American foreign policy elites have of the U.S. role in the world. Now, that role is maintained for a whole host of reasons. But think about this. Were we not the ultimate guarantor of Europe's security? Were we not the ultimate guarantor of Japan's security? Were we not the ultimate guarantor of South Korea's security? Would that status of primacy be as possible? And I submit to you that it would not. So I think that our reasons for wanting the status quo in Europe, and this was implied in something that Justin and Rachel have said before, goes well beyond Europe. And so I would say, if anything, I think about it now, who's to blame, the Europeans or the American foreign policy establishment? I think the U.S. foreign policy establishment is actually more to blame, because we have created the circumstance in which the problem that we complain about but don't do anything about exists in the first place.
Well, unless the whole, we're saying one thing, which is that we want a stable balance of power, and we want it to be provided to the maximum extent possible by the Europeans. But it seems like in some ways what you're saying is we don't really mean it. And what we really want is to be, numero uno, including on the European continent, call the shots. And, when our preferences compete, what we really want is sidekicks, not, partners. Is that?
I'll take it one step further. I know my colleagues would like to jump in. I may be in a minority here, but I think given the performance of the Russian army, it's entirely possible that this war will end with something that Ukraine can credibly call a win. Now, let's stipulate that for a moment, and we don't have to argue about that. Even if that happens, I think the lesson learned will be that it was the United States intervention through, what is it now, $35 billion, $40 billion in arms that made that possible. In a sense, that's true. And the lesson that will be taken is not Ukraine blunted the Russian military and stopped it, it will be that the lesson learned from this war is precisely that it is extremely dangerous to make any change in the status quo. And I don't take that lesson, but I will bet you that that will be the lesson learned, not the lesson that we're talking about here.
Well, a perhaps final question, depending on the timing for Justin. Isn't your paper terribly flawed in that there's, I'm joking a little bit, but there's basically two important independent variables that are causing, whatever we want to call it, underbalancing from Europe, not doing enough by our lights. And one of those is having the United States there to balance for you, or overbalance for you, and the other one is the Russian threat and or lack thereof. And in your paper is really about the first one, and you're saying, well, if we really want them to do more, we just cut back on our own contribution to Europe, and then they'll do more. But if the threat's not so big, and this is something Raj and I have discussed a lot, if the threat's not so big, why would they do more? I mean, it kind of goes back to what I said about Germany. Why not just say, no, we're good. We'd like to spend more on our militaries, but it's more important that we pay for people to retire at 60 or whatever, or 62. And I know they're changing it in France, but or trying to. They're burning tires in the street as a result. But anyway, I mean, why not? Why wouldn't that happen?
Right. So this is an argument that's out there that you hear, which is that, the overall US and European contributions to European defense or maybe have like a deadweight loss in there. That in fact, if you just excerpt away the United States today, the Europeans are doing enough today. And I think that's an open question. It's a defensible argument. The question is just where you draw the lines, right? If you draw the line at the German border, yes, Europe west of Germany is spending enough today. But it does seem to me, and this is maybe, I'm sort of thinking out loud here, that the Germans have paid some costs and have had some attention focused on conflicts as far afield as Ukraine. So it seems to me that the German interest, and this is, I think, a good thing from the US point of view, is not geographically, territorially bounded by the borders of Germany. So does Germany want to be able to subsidize the security of the Baltic states? Do they view that as being in their interest, absent a robust U.S. effort to do so? So I think those questions, where those countries draw their own lines, is a sort of TBD matter for me. But do I think that if the United States evaporated tomorrow, that there's a conventional military threat to Germany and France? No, I don't.
Others, comments?
Ben, just a quick point. I said the lesson would be learned that we have to keep the status quo, notwithstanding the performance of the Russian military. We will learn that lesson despite the fact that two countries, one is already on the way, will come into Europe, Sweden and Finland. The Finns have one of the finest armies in Europe. So Europe's capacity, if anything, has been increased. But the argument will be, no, it hasn't. It's actually very vulnerable and things need to stay the same.
I would just add something very short to what Justin closed with, in that there is no conventional threat to France and Germany, which is why we're always going to have issues with deeper defense integration in Europe, because I think the Europeans see it that way as well. You talk to Eastern Europeans, the Poles, the Balts, they do not see it that way. They see a conventional threat to European security on their border at any moment. And the real issue, I think, is going to come down to these east, west, north, south divides. And I don't see those going away anytime soon.
So you don't think there's really any prospect for, Eastern European countries, certainly the Baltics, ever getting to the point where they say, oh, look, it seems like Germany is really serious about spending more in defense. And so, we don't need to hang on to the United States as coattails or whatever the right metaphor is. The European continent can do it, and maybe even will take extended deterrence from the UK, France, or both. Do you think that's just living in a fantasy world, Rachel?
Yes, that's a fantasy world.
So do I. If anything, having been to that part of the world recently, the Baltic states, but especially Poland, are not going to be sold on the idea that the best solution is for greater European self-defense, in which Germany plays a bigger role and the United States plays the smaller role, because the balance of influence, in a sense, in NATO having shifted eastward, the Poles and the Balts, but especially the Poles, are the ones that most want not only the status quo to be maintained, but the level of American engagement to be increased.
Yeah, well, yes, it's perhaps fortunate it's not entirely up to them. But with that, we can have final remarks from each of you, if you would like to, before we close, going in the same order, I suppose, that we started with Justin, Raj, and Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been very good. I just, would maybe close by recapitulating the argument that I made about a counter-hegemonic policy, right? The U.S. material interest in Europe is in preventing one country from dominating Europe. And we should ask ourselves, are we at all close to that prospect today with the war in Ukraine, with the main European powers looking more or less feckless in terms of their own defense? And if the answer to that question is no, then we ought to look at the amount of money, which it's very difficult to slice and dice the figures appropriately. But I don't know, 80 or 90 or $100 billion per year that the United States spends on European security. And that, again, is not something that's going to get you invited to the cool cocktail parties in Georgetown, but has the virtue of being true, and by dint of being true, should be grappled with by analysts.
Raj gets invited to the cool cocktail parties.
Right. Yeah, very often.
At least in New York, so go ahead.
I try to come down to your fair city as infrequently as possible. I think a point that Rachel made is very important to make, because in the Ukraine war, this has come up over and over again. That is the Putin talking point allegation. I think we need to be able to discuss these things without sloganeering and smears. I'm not saying anybody here does that, because the argument that there should be a more robust European capacity to defend Europe, how is that a Putin talking point? It's just absurd. If anything, it's exactly the opposite. I will conclude on a pessimistic note. I mean, we here, the four of us, five of us, are like Sisyphus, right? We push the boulder up the hill, and I think we're fated to do that for a very long time. And at some point, I wonder, is the boulder one day going to run over me? Because I don't really have any faith at all that there will be, in positions of significant authority, people who hold the views that have been articulated here. We will be at the most kind of dissenters, and restraint is now known better in the foreign policy lexicon, but I don't see any evidence that it is now shaping mainstream American policy. I think there's a on the issues that we've talked about when it comes to status quo. There's a consensus among Democrats and Republicans, maybe not on the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, but there's a bipartisan consensus on this.
Your metaphor is actually darker than the actual Sisyphus myth, which is he just pushes the boulder up the hill over and over. And you said it's even worse than that.
Well, I'm wondering, if I were Sisyphus, is the boulder going to one day run over me? And should I
you get the cynicism star for the day, or darkness anyway. Rachel, go ahead. Close it out with maybe a little more hope.
I mean, I think that we have a NATO summit coming up in Vilnius in a few months, and we always talk about this idea of a European pillar in NATO. I think that's something that the U.S. should help support rather than stymie. Last year at the Madrid summit, NATO leaders agreed on this new force model that basically creates this pool of 300,000 troops in a high state of readiness in Europe, which is a massive uptick from the 40,000 that are on high readiness alert now. What if the majority of those troops were European? I mean, that would be a really good start, and I think it would allow the United States to play the role that it has a hard time not playing in terms of having at least some say over how Europe organizes its defense. So I think that would be a good. We're not necessarily hopeful that that will happen, but hey, like, why not? Why not dream big? Could be a good place to look for at the Vilnius summit coming up. So that's what I'll be watching.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. And thanks to all three of you for speaking today. Defense Priorities appreciates it. And this will be online forever. So with that, everyone have a good day.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks.